Good afternoon, and welcome to this session of the Edward Thomas Literary Festival 2020. Throughout his life, Edward Thomas suffered from severe bouts of depression and often found solace within nature. Our next speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Black, explores how Thomas's mental health was intimately linked with his connection to nature and how nature helped his state of mind, and looks at the lessons that we might be able to learn and apply today between the links of nature, mental health and well-being. Dr. Elizabeth Black is an academic with a specialism in eco-criticism, modernism and poetry. Her first book was published in 2017 by Routledge and is titled The Nature of Modernism, Eco-Critical Approaches to the Poetry of Edward Thomas, T.S. Eliot, Edith Sitwell and Charlotte Mew. She is a huge admirer of the work of Edward Thomas and is currently working on researching the link between his work, the eco-gothic and folk horror, which I'm really excited about. But that's not what we're here to find out about today. We're looking at Edward Thomas, mental health, well-being and nature. We hope you enjoy this, but without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Dr. Elizabeth Black. Enjoy.
Hello, my name is Dr. Elizabeth Black, and my talk today is titled Sad Songs of Autumn Mirth, Lessons on Nature and Mental Health from Edward Thomas. I hope that you enjoy it. The outbreak of the coronavirus and the subsequent lockdown earlier this year had a significant impact on many people's relationship with the natural world and the places where they live. It also affected the visual and oral soundscape of the country, with the lack of traffic and aviation noise allowing greater awareness of natural sounds such as birdsong, and the absence of people in the streets encouraging wildlife to return to suburban settings. In the countryside, the deserted lanes and quiet fields would have been much closer to the experience of rural areas that Edward Thomas knew as he walked across such landscapes over 100 years ago. There are other aspects of our experiences this year that also reflect the context in which Edward Thomas was writing. During the coronavirus outbreak, whilst many found themselves with extra leisure time to spend with their families, bake bread, garden or follow other passions, key workers were selflessly and exhaustedly putting themselves at risk to protect others. Public gratitude was evident in the weekly clapping for the NHS and the thank you posters in the windows of many houses. However, many also felt a sense of guilt for having the luxury of keeping safe, as well as a sense of wanting to do more than just simple gestures. The uncertainty and sadness of the situation has also caused a dramatic increase in mental health issues, as people struggle to adjust to new, more limited ways of living. Edward Thomas also lived through a period of seismic change and disruption. Although the situation, context and impact are, of course, very different, some parallels can be found between natural disruption during the First World War and the upheaval we're experiencing now. For example, both share the necessity of remaining separated from family for long periods, the loss of many lives, and the general atmosphere of fear and uncertainty in response to world events that are beyond our control. Feelings of guilt and gratitude towards those risking their lives to keep others safe also connect us to Edward Thomas's experience. Although not required to enlist, as the war continued beyond its expected length, Edward Thomas struggled with the guilt of knowing that as he walked the landscapes he loved, others were cold and damp in the trenches, risking their lives for their country. Always highly self-conscious and analytical, this awareness eventually compelled him to enlist to protect the places he loved. He was killed in the Battle of Arras on Easter Monday, 1917. Despite his poetry being largely unknown during his lifetime, admiration for Edward Thomas has grown since his death. His work has proved particularly resonant in contemporary British nature writing, where his figure continues to cast its shadow, either as a central guide, as in Robert Macfarlane's The Old Ways, or as a touchstone for the experience of deep engagement with nature, as in Horatio Clare's The Light and the Dark and John Lewis Stemple's Where Poppies Blow. In academic discourse, the humility, responsibility, and authenticity of Thomas's response to nature connects his work to the theory of eco-criticism, an area of literary study that examines literary representations of the natural world. In this talk, I will argue that one of the main reasons why Edward Thomas's work remains significant for nature writers, academics, and all other readers is because his deep psychological need for meaningful contact with nature remains highly relevant to contemporary discussions regarding the impact of nature on our mental health. To explore this vital aspect of his writing, I will examine how Edward Thomas's experience of depression are presented in his poetry, and what lessons contemporary readers can draw from his reflections on nature, well-being, and responsibility for the world that sustains us. Throughout his life, Edward Thomas suffered from debilitating bouts of depression. It was a condition that was aggravated by a frustrating domestic life and the stifling demands of what he termed his hack work, the endless stream of books and reviews he wrote to make his living. His wife, Helen, referred to as demons of melancholy and the attacks of gloom and wretchedness that led to days of silence and brooding despair. This acute psychological distress is often identified as a defining feature of his work. John Layman claims that the intensity of suffering in the poems is the element that sets his poetry apart from the great mass of pleasing nature poetry which has been produced since the World War. F.R. Leavis also found the psychological aspect of Thomas's work to be the dominant feature, stating that the outward scene is accessory to an inner theatre. Always extremely self-aware, Thomas understood his own depression incisively, telling a friend, "My self-criticism, or rather my studied self-contempt, is now nearly a disease." He was formally diagnosed with neurasthenia, an ill-defined condition marked by anxiety, listlessness, and introspection. The illness caused periods of deep despair, and once even drove him to take a revolver into the woods with the intention of ending his life. Thomas tried to cure his depression through periods of giving up alcohol, meat, and sugar, by using opium, and by engaging in talking therapy with Godwin Baines, an early proponent of psychoanalysis. All had limited success. His introspection and low moods would eventually be eased by his friendship with the American poet Robert Frost, who encouraged him to begin to write poetry, and by finally ending his tortuous inclination towards indecision by enlisting to fight in the war. However, throughout his life, the one cure Thomas always returned to as a way of easing his depressive episode was what we may now term ecotherapy or green care, walking for days through the British countryside, immersing himself in nature, and paying close attention to the physical world beyond the self. He was trying, as Robert Macfarlane phrases it, to outmarch his sadness, and often he was successful. As he wrote to his friend Job Bottomley, "I'm never so well as when I am rid of the postman and all company, walking 20 or 30 miles a day." For Edward Thomas, this need for contact with nature went beyond the pursuit of escapism, leisure, or aesthetic pleasure. It was, as Jonathan Bate explains, a psychological necessity, an underpinning of the self, a way of connecting the self to the environment. The result of this combination of intense psychological inquiry with acute observations of the non-human world was a new form of nature poetry, possessing an unflinching honesty in its analysis of the impact of exposure to nature on mental health that we can still learn from today. So how exactly did nature ease Edward Thomas's depression? This is a complex question, but there are answers to be found in the poem. Through reading Edward Thomas's poetry, one of the key ways in which nature soothed his painful introspection was by encouraging him to look beyond the self and pay attention to external presences, consciousness, and perspectives. This freedom from self-examination to recognize the otherness of nature brought a sense of humility and wonder that lifted his mood and allowed periods of respite from self. As Matthew Hollis explains, by paying attention to the external world, Edward Thomas learnt that, as a human being, he must always remain outside the experience of the animal, as if knowledge was uncertain, guessed at, and yet still possible to catch for the careful listener. The result of this heightened awareness of other forms of life on his mental health can be seen in The Unknown Bird.
The Unknown Bird. 3 lovely notes he whistled, too soft to be heard if others sang, but others never sang. In the great beech wood all that May and June, no one saw him, I alone could hear him, though many listened. Was it but 4 years ago, or 5? He never came again. Oftenest when I heard him I was alone, nor could I ever make another hear. La, 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 he called, seemingly far off, as if a cock crowed past the edge of the world, as if the bird or I were in a dream. Yet that he travelled through the trees and sometimes neared me was plain, though somehow distant still he sounded. All the proof is, I told men what I had heard. I never knew a voice, man, beast, or bird, better than this. I told the naturalist, but neither had they heard anything like the notes that did so haunt me. I had them clear by heart, and have them still. 4 years, or 5, have made no difference. Then, as now, that la, 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 was bodiless, sweet, sad more than joyful it was, if I must say that it was one or another. But if sad, 'twas sad only with joy too far off for me to taste it. But I cannot tell if truly never anything but fair the days were when he sang, as now they seem. This surely I know, that I who listened then, happy sometimes suffering, a heavy body and a heavy heart, now straightway, if I think of it, become light as that bird wandering beyond my shore.
In the poem, the speaker is unable to identify the source of the haunting 3 lovely notes of the bird's call. The sound is both completely separate from the speaker and mysteriously connected to their personal sadness. Characteristically, Thomas does not impose an anthropomorphic narrative on the bird's song, but retains its mystery, with even the recollection of its call having the power to alleviate his despair and allow him to temporarily escape his heavy body and heavy heart to become light as that bird wandering beyond my shore. A similar respite from this excruciating self-consciousness and despair is evident in Beauty. In the opening of the poem, the speaker describes himself as tired, angry, and ill at ease, bleakly composing an epitaph for themselves as all that no one loved of him and that loved no one. Finding a language for his despair through natural imagery, the speaker likens their mood to a river at fall of evening, while it seemed that never has the sun lighted it or warmed it. However, even whilst expressing this sense of acute disconnection from the world, the speaker feels that some fraction of themselves happily floats through the window, even now, to a tree, like a dove that slants and swerving to its home and love. The moment of separation from the despairing self and the connection to nature eases his self-reproach, and in a rare moment of acceptance, in the final line, the speaker recognises beauty is there. Nature also provided Thomas with a language to communicate the experience of despair and alienation. This can be seen in aspens, where the speaker's affinity towards a tree that others find melancholy allows them to achieve greater self-knowledge and self-expression.
From Aspens. Whatever wind blows while they and I have leaves, we cannot other than an aspen be, that ceaselessly, unreasonably grieves, or so men think who like a different tree.
Here the sense of identification with the trees is stated explicitly, as the aspens are shown to shake their leaves and men may hear, but need not listen more than to my rhymes. This affiliation with the trees which stand outside the village rather than with the clink, the hum, the roar, the random singing of the people in the inn, reveals the essential loneliness of the speaker and his inability to rid himself of the sadness which binds his character to the trees. However, whilst neither the tree nor speaker can control the association of their quiet, persistent voices with grief, the final lines indicate that an acceptance of self is achieved through identification with nature. The feeling of connection to nature is central to Edward Thomas's mental health, with moments of respite from depression always being associated with the experience of belonging in the world. However, one of the most important aspects of Edward Thomas's relationship with nature that is central to the continuing relevance of his work is his understanding that melancholy cannot always be fixed by contact with nature, and nature should not be reduced to a source of comfort for humans. Instead, he understands that both self and the natural world are infinitely more complex, changeable, and autonomous than this. This knowledge means that the moments in the poem where a feeling of connection with nature is felt and the easing of depression is experienced are celebrated because Thomas also knows the opposite feeling of despair, which is rooted in a feeling of complete estrangement from nature. As Robert Macfarlane explains, what he has come to understand painfully is that one may too easily take the natural world as companion, friend, and salve. Nature can cure, but it can also be brutally mute, shocking in its disinterest. The river's seaward run, the chalk's whiteness, the hawk's swivelling stare. One of the bleakest examples of this isolation is in Thomas's prose work, The Icknield Way, where Thomas describes a particularly severe bout of depression exacerbated by a solitary night spent listening to a downpour of rain, which tellingly concludes with the statement that I'm not a part of nature, I am alone.
From the Icknield Way. I lay awake listening to the rain, and at first it was as pleasant to my ear and my mind as it had long been desired. But before I fell asleep, it had become a majestic and finally a terrible thing. The all-night rain puts out summer like a torch. In the heavy black rain, falling straight from invisible dark sky to invisible dark earth, the heat of summer is annihilated. The splendor is dead. The summer is gone. The summer is gone, and never can it return. There will never be any summer anymore, and I am weary of everything. I stay because I am too weak to go. I crawl on because it is easier than to stop. I put my face to the window. There is nothing out there but the blackness and sound of rain. Neither when I shut my eyes can I see anything. I am not a part of nature. I am alone. There is nothing else in my world but the dead heart and brain within me and the rain without.
He later adapted the passage into the poem Rain, which describes how the deluge of rain, midnight rain, nothing but the wild rain, creates a sense of desolation which erases everything but the love of death. Jan Marsh suggests that Thomas's melancholy stemmed from his inability to convey his delight in the country as vividly as he felt it. This painful sense of self-limitation is present in poems such as Health and The Glory. In Health, the speaker mercilessly dissects his personal failings in comparison to the perfection of the spring day, which promises all and fails in nothing. Restricted by his physical capabilities and debilitating depression, the speaker knows that his acute self-consciousness means that he could not be as the wagtail who was twittering happily and sweetly. However, some value is found in being separate from non-human nature, because unlike the birds who know not the sun, or the sun who regards not the birds, the speaker is conscious of the whole scene. I am almost proud to love both bird and sun, though scarce this spring could my body leap 4 yards. In the glory, the speaker again finds himself lacking in comparison to the glory of the beauty of the morning, which invites me, yet it leaves me scorning all I can ever do, all I can be. The beauty of the day provokes characteristic indecision in the speaker, who cannot lift himself out of his discontent. Drawing upon non-human perspectives to better understand his mood, the speaker asks, must I be content with discontent, as larks and swallows are perhaps with wings? At the close of the poem, the worrying indecision and the self-criticism, in contrast to the magnificence of nature, heightens the speaker's self-contempt, and he concedes, I cannot fight the day to the core. There are points in Edward Thomas's life and poetry where despair and self-hatred creates a desire for the ultimate escape from self through death. Characteristically, death is framed in Thomas's poetry through natural imagery that reflects both the law of death and the unknown aspect of its absolute otherness. Most frequently, the idea of death is symbolized through pathways, forests, and night. Thomas's love of these things reflecting the enticing prospect of peace and absolution that he craved. The act of enlisting in the army shifted Thomas's treatment of death from an imaginative possibility to an immediate probability. In Lights Out, the real prospect of death and its absolute nature elicits genuine fear, but this is met by Thomas's personal bravery, coupled with the comforting natural imagery of nights, forests, and sleep.
Lights Out. I have come to the borders of sleep, the unfathomable deep forest, where all must lose their way, however straight or winding, soon or late, they cannot choose. Many a road and track that, since the dawn's first crack, up to the forest brink, deceived the travellers, suddenly now blurs, and in they sink. Here love ends, despair, ambition ends, all pleasure and all trouble, although most sweet or bitter, here ends in sleep that is sweeter than tasks most noble. There is not any book or face of dearest look that I would not turn from now to go into the unknown I must enter and leave alone, I know not how. The tall forest towers, its cloudy foliage lowers ahead, shelf above shelf. Its silence I hear and obey, that I may lose my way and myself.
The parallel feelings of fear and desire are seen again in my favourite of Edward Thomas's poems. His delicately nuanced final published poem, Out in the Dark. Here death is presented through the imagery of night, animals, forests and stars. Fear is present, but the complex phrasing of the final stanza balances the immensity of oblivion with a love of the night to prevent despair from overwhelming the poem.
Out in the dark, out in the dark over the snow, the fallow fawns invisible go, with a fallow doe, and the winds blow fast as the stars are slow. Stealthily the dark haunts round, and when the lamp goes without sound, at a swifter bound than the swiftest hound, arrives, and all else is drowned. And star and I and wind and deer are in the dark together, near yet far, and fear drums on my ear in that sage company drear. How weak and little is the light, all the universe of sight, love and delight before the might, if you love it not, of night.
So what knowledge can we as contemporary readers take from Edward Thomas' Thomas's reflections on nature, self, and well-being. I've identified 3 key lessons from his poetry that continue to resonate over 100 years later. The first lesson is the benefit of paying close attention to the world beyond ourselves, especially to the small and often overlooked parts of nature. Thomas's poems are notable for their interest in what he called the innumerable holes and corners of England. Rather than focusing only on the grand and picturesque, Thomas's poetry gives value to aspects of place that are not traditionally celebrated in poetry, such as decaying barns, wood piles, nettle patches, and overgrown pathways. By finding beauty and importance in the seemingly innocuous or understated aspects of nature, Edward Thomas was able to identify signs of change in minute details in the landscape. This can be seen in his acute observations of the liminal period between winter and spring, in And These Things Also.
But these things also. But these things also are springs. On banks by the roadside the grass, long dead, that is greyer now than all the winter it was. The shell of a little snail bleached in the grass, chip of flint and mite of chalk, and a small bird's dung in splashes of purest white. All the white things a man mistakes for earliest violets, who seeks through winter's ruins something to pay winter's debts, while the north blows and starling flocks by chattering on and on keep their spirits up in the mist, and spring's here, winter's not gone.
This curiosity and attentiveness to things that are often considered unattractive, so overlooked, is also evident in November, where the speaker's attention is drawn to the muddy paths composed of twig, leaf, flint and thorn, and patterned by the tracks of men and animals. The boot imprints are a literal representation of the impact of humans on the earth that are common throughout Thomas's poetry. The speaker finds these muddy paths that few care for to be the prettiest things on the ground, because he recognises how central the dark density of the ground is in clarifying the sky's cloudless heavenly light. These acts of valuing the smaller aspects of nature are also central to Tall Nettles, where the poet's incisive study of a nettle patch in the corner of the farmyard is so detailed that it describes how the dust on the leaves are displaced by rain. This curiosity and care towards the overlooked or common remains important because it encourages us to be attentive to nature in our immediate surroundings, rather than idealising pastoral versions of nature seen as existing beyond our daily experiences. Edward Thomas's poetry may focus on the British countryside, but his love of nature stems from his urban childhood on Wandsworth Common. This lifelong commitment to valuing aspects of nature overlooked by art and literature becomes increasingly important to contemporary life, as over 80% of the UK population now live in urban areas. It teaches us that nature and its capacity to enhance our well-being is present everywhere, and that in order to protect nature, we must first notice and value it in all forms, in all the places where we live. The second lesson to be drawn from Edward Thomas's poetry is that even during times of solitude or estrangement, it's important to see ourselves as a meaningful part of a wider community. Thomas mostly walked alone, but as he did, he recognised how all places are continually shaped by human and non-human presences, remarking that it is sometimes consoling to remember how much of the pleasantness of English country is due to men by chance or design. Recognising ourselves to be part of a broader history of people who have shaped our surroundings can enhance our sense of self and belonging. It can also help us to regard ourselves as useful agents for practical environmental change. Edward Thomas's understanding of the humanness of place and the ability of even one individual to shape a landscape can be seen in Bob's Lane. In the poem, the speaker traces the history of a disused lane to the life of shovel-bearded Bob, a farmer who planted elm trees all along it. The simple act is motivated by Bob's love of most living things, but a tree chiefly. In planting the trees, the farmer creates a legacy which ties him to place even after his death, when the name alone survives, Bob's Lane, and continues to shape the human experience of place as travellers hear from the slow climbing train the stormcock singing from the elms. As the team's head brass also shows the impact of human actions and absences on the land. The initial description of ploughing seems to portray a conventional rural scene, but the conversation between the speaker and the ploughman reveals an intricate chain of events that connects the fighting in France to changes to the land, community and individuals at home. The presence of the fallen elm, which the ploughman cannot move until the unknown time when the war's over, illustrates how the absence of farm workers physically alters the rural landscape. Even a single death has repercussions, and the ploughman muses that everything would have been different if the war had not started and his friend had not been killed. The disconcerting sense of uncertainty is deepened by the final image of the horses stumbling as they start out for the last time, foreshadowing the poet's imminent absence from the landscape, as well as the disappearance of that particular rural scene as the mechanisation of farming and further depopulation of the countryside permanently altered British agriculture. One of the key aspects of Edward Thomas's knowledge of the countryside is his understanding of the intimate and complex connections between the land and the people who live on it. In this context, the sudden absence of so many men from country places during the First World War is marked in his poems by a sense of mourning and absence in the landscape. The quiet emptiness of the countryside enables the speaker to hear the trees whispering and the birds singing, but it also reveals not only the impact of countrymen fighting abroad, but also the consequences of the agricultural depression of the 1870s, which stemmed from a culmination of urbanisation, poor weather, cheap food imports and bad harvests. As a war poet, who rarely mentions the conflict explicitly in his poems, Edward Thomas conveyed the full pity of war through its impact on the British countryside and country traditions. For example, in The Cherry Trees, his immense pity for the loss of so many is presented through the absence of marrying couples.
The cherry trees. The cherry trees bend over and are shedding on the old road where all the past are dead. Their petals strewing the grass as for a wedding, this early May morn when there is none to wed.
Another example is In Memoriam, Easter 1915, a four-line poem that manages in its simplicity to depict the disparity between the abundance of nature and the scarcity of human activity.
In Memoriam, Easter 1915. The flowers left thick at nightfall in the wood this Eastertide call into mind the men now far from home, who, with their sweethearts should, have gathered them and will do never again.
It's a poem that gathers resonance for the contemporary reader, who preempts a further disappearance from the landscape as the poet makes his final journey to war. By illustrating the consequences of fighting abroad on the physical and social landscape of the British countryside, the poem emphasises the complex interconnections between humans and nature and presents the countryside as a composite of human and non-human presences, where the fate of one is inversely correlated with that of the other. The significance of this knowledge is linked to the third and most important lesson we can take from Edward Thomas, the importance of personal responsibility for the physical environment. The third lesson that Thomas's poetry can teach us is the importance of acting to protect the environment. One of the key connections between Edward Thomas's war poetry and our contemporary knowledge of environmental crisis in the age of the Anthropocene is an awareness of the vulnerability of nature to human actions and the challenge of how to meaningfully respond to this. Edward Thomas did not love the countryside in a way that ignored change or disregarded threats to the environment. The relief from depression he gained from time in the natural world was accompanied with a sense of responsibility to protect it that ultimately took his life. Edward Thomas was clear about why he chose to enlist to fight in the First World War. Crumbling some soil between his fingers, he told his friend that he was fighting, literally, for this. Reflecting further on his decision, he emphasized how this sense of responsibility clarified his understanding of place. Whilst it would be anachronistic to read the poems through the lens of the current knowledge about anthropogenic climate change, what does resonate across the period is Thomas's awareness of the vulnerability of nature and the importance of closely observing the natural world for signs of change. This is exemplified in How at Once.
How at once? How at once should I know, when stretched in the harvest blue, I saw the Swift's black bow, that I would not have the view another day, until next May again it is due. The same year after year, but with the Swift alone. With other things I but fear that they will be over and done suddenly, and I only see them to know them gone.
In the poem, the speaker's celebration of the Swifts who return the same year after year is undermined by an intangible anxiety about the vulnerability of human and non-human life. This tension between what is certain and what is now in doubt is also explored in March, where the speaker searches for signs of spring, asserting that, now I know that spring will come again, perhaps tomorrow. In the poem, he observes the natural world for signs of spring, despite the cold burning of hail and wind, and mountains on mountains of snow and ice in the west. The unseasonable weather is disconcerting, but recognizing the limits of human knowledge, the speaker looks to nature, asking, what do the thrushes know? Importantly, Edward Thomas does not attempt to translate or anthropomorphisize the bird's song or humanize its message. But neither are the birds completely separate, as the speaker acknowledges their shared presence in place and their sensitivity to seasonal change, something they knew, I also. The presence of the birds strengthens his trust in the continuity of nature, but his optimism is undercut by a qualification that spring returns, perhaps tomorrow. These lessons drawn from Edward Thomas's poetry allow us to consider ways of engaging with nature that have the potential to improve mental health and increase environmental responsibility. However, it's important to recognise that for many there are barriers to attempting to replicate such deep engagement with nature. As a white, middle-class, able-bodied male, Edward Thomas had the freedom and ability to wander the countryside without fear of experiencing hostility, harm, or difficulties. For others, the countryside holds more barriers. It is noticeable that whilst Edward Thomas would impulsively leave home for days to walk across the south of England, his wife Helen was left to cover the childcare and domestic responsibilities at home. For women now, the desire to walk alone is often tempered by a fear for personal safety. It was an issue highlighted recently on Twitter. A provocative post asked the question of what women would do if men had a 9 p.m. curfew. The response was overwhelmingly focused on the desire to be able to walk alone anywhere, at any time of day or night. Fear of hostility is also cited as a reason why there is such a low percentage of visitors to national parks from the BAME community in Britain, and why, until the recent arrival of the Willowherb Journal, this absence was also reflected in minority representation in nature writing. Access to the countryside is also restricted by financial restraints, with a lack of adequate public transport and the expense of reaching rural areas blocking many from doing so. More recently, many who are shielding due to their heightened vulnerability should they contract COVID-19 feel that the outside world still holds considerable risk. This will be a feeling understood by many disabled people for whom access to the countryside remains difficult. Recognising that for many there are serious serious difficulties in getting out into nature is important because it moves the discussion beyond accepting that nature is good for mental health to considering how these benefits can be shared by all. Whilst these barriers to replicating Edward Thomas's intense engagement with the British countryside require continuing discussion, the central message of the potential for contact with nature to improve mental health remains pertinent. Awareness of the impact of nature on our well-being has recently gained media attention, with Scottish GPs now prescribing hiking and birdwatching for patients, and research from neuroscience identifying strong links between exposure to nature and wellness. In a time when the continual stream of scientific reports about the devastating consequences of climate change can make us feel overwhelmed by the size of the challenge, poets such as Edward Thomas provide a space for us to reconsider how we live in the world. Edward Thomas's poetic exploration of the relationship between nature and mental health remains vital because he understood that whilst nature could often ease depression, it was not a cure for the illness, nor should it be reduced to a source of relief for human problems. Instead, he recognises the complexity and autonomy of both humans and nature, and the need to protect nature beyond its human value. Edward Thomas cared so much for the landscapes he loved and that had eased his suffering that he lost his life protecting them. Over 100 years later, he continues to teach us to pay close attention to nature and repay the pleasure it provides us by protecting it. In these ways, the poet who Ted Hughes called the father of us all continues to hold important lessons for the benefit of both the human and non-human world. Thank you very much for listening to my talk, and I look forward to answering any questions in the following discussion.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dr. Black, and thank you very much for everyone for watching. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. As Dr. Black said at the end there, we are now going to go to a live Q&A session. You should have been sent a link to the Zoom invite for that as part of the booking process at some point. If you didn't, then don't worry. There will be a link coming up shortly, which you can click on, and that should take you through as well and have all the information that you need to join. It's a great chance to be able to put your questions to Dr. Black and hopefully get some more fascinating insights and answers from that. So we look forward to seeing you there. And for now, goodbye.